So I want to make sure I introduce myself to any new faces in the chat. Those of you that this is your like third time in 24 hours to see me, you're like, we know, we get it already. Um, but there are some new faces. My name is Katie Deering, and I'm the secondary literacy content coach here at Region 11. Faith Schwope is my facilitator, and so she's going to be manning the chat, trying to answer questions slash fielding questions to debrief every few slides or so. And she's also going to be sharing some things in the chat with you. So here in just a second, Faith is going to share the link to our attendance form. You want to make sure that you fill that Google form out so that you get credit for attending the session today. Okay, Faith, do you want to say anything?
It's got me looking for the link. So. Hello, everyone. Welcome to it's going to be a great session with Katie today. I'm really looking forward to it.
Faith is one of our team leads for the content team. She is a math rock star and makes me look at math as an English person in a way that I never really dreamed I would. So we love Faith. Just a couple of norms for our meeting. Again, some of this is redundant if you've attended more than one webinar, but I want to make sure we address it. Please make sure that you introduce yourself in the chat. I looked earlier and I saw a lot of people connecting there, which is so great. We need any connection that we can get right now. So people like finding some small world things. And I also saw some people sharing in the chat what they're wanting to know today about reading conferences. And so it seems like what you're saying that you want to know is in line with what I thought you'd want to know. So we're all on the same page, which is awesome. Please keep your audio muted until it's time to debrief or share something out. If you do need to get up or walk away or whatever, please feel free to stop your video share, even though I prefer to see everybody's faces. It lets me know that people aren't like asleep or watching Netflix while they have my, mouth blabbering on the whole time. So I'd appreciate that. And then as we're talking, if you have questions, please feel free to type those into the chat. I have some notes here on this session because we do have a lot to cover with reading conferences. There's just a lot of moving parts. And so I have written down here that every few slides, I'm just going to kind of stop and pause and we'll check the chat for any of those questions. Okay. And there might be some things that I might have answers for later on in the webinar. So we might skip over a couple of those things and then come back to them. Okay. So we're just going to go ahead and have some fun. I have tried my best to not lose my street cred with young people. When I was a classroom teacher, I always like knew the lingo and I felt like I was super cool, even though I'm like the adult that's trying to look cool. And so part of that has been me trying to understand TikTok. So y'all can laugh at me, it's fine. I see people shaking their head like, nope, don't do it. But there's a person on TikTok that always does vibe checks and it makes me laugh really hard. So I thought we would do a vibe check here. Either of those gifts have captured my vibe at any point during this quarantine. Sometimes I feel super positive where I'm just like, all the bad energy, get out of here. And then sometimes I'm like, I need you to stop smiling at me. Like even through the camera, I can't handle it. So if you look at the QR code, or Faith is also going to post just a URL in the chat, I want you to think of maybe up to 3 words that would describe your current vibe as far as working from home or just anything that's going on in your life right now. So just there's going to be 3 spots. You can put up to 3 responses in, words that would describe your vibe. Okay. So you can use the QR code or you can use the link that Faith is going to put in the chat. So I'm seeing a lot of chill. I'm really impressed with y'all. I would say if I had to pick 3 words, I don't know that chill would even make my top 20. Like that's what I strive to be, but I'm not anywhere close. I see people put sad several times, and I can definitely resonate with that as well. I've been seeing a lot of pictures lately on social media of teachers bagging up student items and just like the empty classrooms with no kids. And man, like that hurts. I feel a lot. I see Schrodinger's cat. That makes me laugh. Lots of overwhelming, exhausting, chaotic, stressful. I do see some positive ones, grateful, enjoying. There's lots of silver linings that we can probably find. Excited, tired. I definitely resonate with that one as well. Distracted. Oh, I like potential. I see a couple of people have put potential in there that this really has opened up some opportunities for us to do some really great things for kids that maybe we had never been aware that we needed to do or to do differently. So there is a lot of great potential on what's possible. Let's see what else. Surprising, crazy. Yeah, I feel that. This today is the second day in 2 months that this hair has touched a heat product. I did it for y'all. You're welcome. But at one point I was like, I think I've forgotten how to do this. Like, I think I put half of my highlighter on my face today. I was like glowing really hard. So, you know, we're all just trying to make it work. So I definitely feel a lot of those. So I hope that today will give you some positive vibes. I hope that you're going to leave this webinar with lots of feel goods and lots of positivity and lots of excitement for what we're going to be able to do for kids. Okay. So just to kind of talk through what the structure is going to be with this session, I know that a lot of us are going to be coming into looking at reading conferences with different levels of knowledge and experience, right? The title of this session was very intentional. So when we're looking at implementation, I'm going to have things in here for people who don't even really know how to articulate what a conference is versus how can I ramp up what I'm already doing? How can I use some extra tools? So no matter where you are in that spectrum, hopefully you walk away with something really useful. And I'm also going to be linking at the very end of the session a Google folder that's going to have all of the handouts and different resources that I'm going to show you today. Okay, so you'll have some tools that you'll be able to take with you. And again, if you have any questions at all, make sure you capture the chat. Okay, so let's just do some defining. What is a conference? Let's talk about that. So bottom line, I'm going to back up a little bit, is a conference is a way to provide differentiated instruction that's responsive to student need. Okay. A conference is meant to be one-on-one or sometimes two-on-one, depending what kind of conference you're doing, but it's very different from small group instruction, right? With a small group, I'm going to have data that I'm collecting and I'm going to be grouping kids based on needs and I'm going to be meeting that need. A conference is really meant to be more in the moment instruction. A lot of times it can be on the fly. And it's meant to be very short. So a conference with a student is not a 20-minute session. It's 3 or 4 minute conversations, okay? When we think about conferencing, I will tell you that as a teacher, conferencing is probably my favorite thing that I ever did with kids. And when I would survey kids at the end of the year to ask them what their favorite thing that they did or the thing that we did in class that grew them the most, they listed conferencing as their favorite as well. So I can't say enough of if I did away with everything else that I did as a classroom teacher, conferencing would be something that I would cling to and would stay with me. So what happens in a conference? What does that conversation look like? So this is an architecture that we've developed based on some training that we received in Columbia University from the Teachers College and kind of tweaked it with some other research that we've seen. So in a conference that you're having with a student, most of the time, the first thing that's going to happen is you have to figure out what you're going to talk about with them, right? So you're going to do some research. And what we mean by research is you're going to either ask them some questions or you're going to listen to them read. So those are ways that we can find out what a student might need help with. Once I'm doing that, I'm going to ask some questions, or I'm going to listen to them read, or maybe a blend of both. I'm going to decide on one thing that I want to specifically compliment them on. And I'm also going to look for one thing that I think I might be able to give them some help with. Okay. Something that's very specific and targeted. So once I've done my research, again, I want to give them a specific compliment. I want to stay away from language like great job, good job reading. Especially the older kids get, the more that they can kind of see through some of our teacher language. And so we want to give them specific comments. So things like, I really like the way that you read that dialogue with inflection. You changed your voice up to try to match the character, and I thought that that was really effective. That's specific. It's letting them know that I heard what you did, and now I am able to recognize that and I see it. Okay. And with those specific compliments, when I'm lifting you up, it enables them to be a little bit more willing to work through some of the toughness with me. So then in a conference, I'm going to explicitly teach or coach them in a targeted area that I think is going to lend a lot of leverage. Okay. And we're going to talk really nitty gritty in a little bit about like, how do I know what I help them with? How do I know where the deficits are? How do I meet those needs? We're going to talk a lot about that. But if we're just looking specifically at what is a conference, I'm going to use some gradual release. Maybe I model that with a student, or either I talk my thinking out loud, or I model it with the text with them right there in the moment. And then they get to practice it and do it. And then what I'm hoping that they do is I'm going to try to link that to whatever they're working on right now, so that when I walk away, they're going to continue to practice that and to do that. Okay. So when do I do that? Because that seems like a lot. When does conferencing usually take place? Well, so I have this really artistically done sketch note that I made on my iPad for this because I couldn't find the graphic that I wanted. And so this is just a very bared down what reading workshop could look like so that you even have time to do some conferencing. So in a typical reading workshop classroom, the teacher's not going to be talking for 45 minutes. Whoever's doing the talking is doing the learning. I can't say it enough, right? And so what we want to do is we want to give them a specific targeted mini lesson and then let them practice whatever we've taught them with a text, whether that's a whole group text, whether that's the text that they've chosen to read, whether it's a book club text, whatever it is. They need time to do that in real time, and then I can offer in support, right? So when does conferencing take place? It's while kids are reading or practicing that skill. So either they're reading independently, maybe they're reading and working with a partner, but that's when I can push in, and I can do conferences a blend of ways. I can schedule them to make sure that I'm meeting with lots of kids regularly. I can do impromptu in the moment conferences, or I can do a little bit of both. And I will tell you this just from my personal experience, a lot of people feel really, really uncomfortable and awkward conferencing with students the first time they start to try it. And that's what keeps them from doing it regularly, because the kids are like, why are you talking to me? And we're like, I don't know. Some lady told me to do it. And it feels really uncomfortable. And we just kind of look at each other and then we back away. And so sometimes starting conferences by scheduling them out, it helps you to hold yourself accountable to do it, because then the kids know what to expect. And there's also going to be some of your students that need the scheduled conference. If you have any high anxiety kiddos, if you have any students that really fixate on schedule and task that need that mental prep time, I think that's really important. So I've done both. When I first started writing workshop, I scheduled everything. And then as I felt really comfortable and I felt like I could be more in the moment and give some spot on feedback, then I was able to do more impromptu. And by the time I left the classroom, most of my conferencing was on the fly, impromptu conferencing. So, and those things took place over the span of about 3 years of me really feeling like I could own that practice. So if you try conferencing and you accidentally talk to a kid for 10 minutes, you know, or you realize, oh, it's been 3 weeks and I haven't talked to this kid, it's okay. Nobody's really perfect at it. But when we're thinking about that timing, it's while kids are doing the work. I mentioned this quote in a webinar I did earlier today. But Fontes and Pinnell, who are foundational with things like guided reading, a lot of elementary people are really familiar with their work. Um, Fontes and Pinnell say that conferencing isn't the icing on the cake, it is the cake. So when I think about the best teaching that I can possibly give, there's no way in a classroom setting of 30 kids that my lesson is going to help every single kid gain mastery. And so if I can mentally shift myself away from that mentality to say, I don't have to keep talking until they get it. I can give them enough to grapple with it, and then I can go in and provide differentiated instruction to my students, and then I can meet them where they are so that eventually we all get there. So the mastery piece doesn't have to take place in that whole group setting, okay? And there's lots of types of conferences. So what I just described to you with the architecture of the 4 pieces, that's something that we call a research, decide, teach conference. Okay, that's what that's called. So again, the name is pretty self-explanatory. I'm researching, I'm deciding what I'm going to compliment them on and what I'm going to work with them on, and then I'm going to provide that explicit teaching and practice. You can do that a couple of different ways, and we're going to talk a little bit about which types of conferences to use when, thinking through the lens of a school year, as well as kind of gauging your comfort level with conferencing, okay? So with research, decide, teach, my recommendation is when you're first starting to do these kinds of conferences with kids, that we focus on their reader identity and their readerly life first. So my last 4 years in the classroom, I taught 11th and 12th grade kids. So they're 16, 17, and 18 years old, right? Most of them hated reading and hadn't picked up a book since like elementary school. So I have a lot of years where my students were not engaged with that practice, that I was having to undo a lot of mentalities and a lot of misconceptions and a lot of negative self-statements with my kids who said, I'm not a reader, I don't like reading, I don't want to do it. And that takes time. And so a lot of those first conferences were focused on me asking questions like, tell me what the last book you read was, start to finish, even if you were like 7. What's the last book you remember reading? And did you like it? What's the last book that you remember liking? Has there been any movies that are based on books that you like? Well, what kinds of movies do you like? And recommending things and really trying to get to the root of who does this kid see themselves as a reader in this classroom, and how can I adjust that identity so that they'll be willing to give text a try, okay? That allows me to really get to know them as a person. I know I was talking to somebody about this, but you can really learn a lot about a person when you start looking at what they read. And in both a good and a bad way, I think. Like when people look at my Goodreads, I kind of wonder what the impression is that they get of who I am. But it's kind of an intimate thing to really get to know somebody and what they like to read, their reading habits, even talking about like at home, like their access to text at home, memories that they have. Have you ever read with either of your parents or any family members? What about your siblings? And having some of those conversations with them. And so once I get to a point where I feel like I know my students as readers, we've established a good reading culture, then I can start to shift those research, decide, teach conferences to be more skill-based. So based on the TEKS that I'm teaching, based on any deficits that I'm seeing when I'm doing my 6-week assessments or when I'm gathering data in other ways, I can start to really target some of those areas that our students are struggling with. And I think about the situation right now that we're in where our students are going to have gaps next year. And when we think about all the things we have to cram in already, going in and addressing those gaps can feel really, really daunting. So thinking through the lens of responsive instruction, of using things like conferring or using small group instruction as ways to fill those gaps. Not all 30 kids in your classroom need the same things. So this would be a way to meet that need as well. Another type of conference that I want to make sure we know about is complement conferencing. And it's just as fun as it sounds. But I think a lot of teachers, and you'll feel skeptical probably when I say this, but this is very true. A lot of teachers struggle hard with a compliment conference. So all that a compliment conference is I will go to a student, I will ask them some questions, or I will listen to them read. I will give them one specific targeted compliment, and that's it. No helping. And that's where the teachers struggle, is because when you have a kid that can't read fluently and is butchering everything, you just want to give them one little tip. Like, let me just tell you one thing real quick. And that's really hard. And so with a compliment conference, we do not teach. We give positive feedback and we walk away. And I put on here as well table compliment conferences, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. There's some other different kinds of ways that you can conference later on in the year. I put on here 2-on-1, and usually that's pretty impromptu. Let's say hypothetically I'm conferencing with Faith, but Danielle is sitting right beside Faith, and Danielle stops doing what she's doing and she's looking in. Then I might go, all right, Danielle, why don't you join us? Because it might be something that Danielle could benefit from too. I don't usually plan my conferences that way, but it's something that I will pull in kids that are sitting close, that look like they're listening in, because it can't hurt to hear. And then later on in the year, once your classroom has great community, it is possible to do some peer conferencing where you might hear something that a student has a question about, and your class might have good enough relationships to say, well, Susie is really, really strong at finding those thematic statements. So Susie, I want you to come over here and I want y'all to just talk quickly for 5 minutes, and you can start to build in some of that peer coaching. So I feel like I've thrown a lot of information out just as far as what is a conference, when do conferences take place, and what kinds of conferences are there. So Faith, are there any questions right now in the chat that we need to debrief?
There is not very many questions, but they are, a couple people have really talked about the conference is the best way to build trust. So that seems to be a thread throughout all of the comments so far. So
awesome. Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I see that multiple times about building relationship first and building that trust, helping them to trust themselves. I think that's so important. Amy Davenport says they just want to know that they are doing something right. Definitely, definitely. And then when we're looking at RTI and any other kind of intervention, we're going to talk a little bit about collecting data during conferences as well. But what a great way to show that you're meeting the needs of students and that you really are differentiating that learning, especially for our tier 2, tier 3 kids, to show that we're at one-on-one intervention and feedback. Okay. I do see a question from Catherine. Would you do these conferences during our sacred independent reading time or after a lesson when you've sent them to work? So Catherine, I have an answer for that question. I don't know if it's going to be what you want, because I think it really depends on the way that your campus or your team structures the learning. So traditionally in my classroom, our independent reading time wasn't separate from everything else. So it wasn't necessarily me teaching a lesson, them doing an assignment, and then we read. A lot of times it was I'm teaching them a lesson while they read, they're focusing on that thing. So if I'm teaching a lesson on characterization, then I have them flip back during that reading time and maybe make some notes on sticky notes that they're seeing characters changing throughout, or they notice there's a foil relationship and they're going to make some comments while they're reading on that. And so I think it just really depends. If you do have separate time set aside for that, I think that you really get to decide. But I know that time is one of our most valuable resources as teachers. And so when we're talking about reading, if there's a non-invasive way that you can confer with kids during sacred reading time, and I'm thinking even if it's scheduled so kids aren't angry that they have the 15 pages to read of their book and then you're bothering them, I think that that's okay. Melinda, I want to put a pin in your question. Faith, don't let me forget to come back to that question about what if kids aren't really reading. I think I'm addressing that later, but don't let me forget to come back to that. Okay. All right. So let's talk about implementation. So a lot of that feels very overwhelming, and a lot of teachers will ask me, when do I start conferring with kids, and what does that look like to build in a system so that you don't have a lot of behavior management issues, that kids will actually talk to you, and it feels productive and fruitful. So here's my suggestion. So at the very beginning of the year, I would start solely with compliment conferences right off the bat. Really focusing in on those positive things, building kids up, kind of like what was said in the chat earlier about letting them trust themselves. And one non-awkward way to do that is through using table compliment conferences. So if you have your desks arranged in clusters, or I used to use tables and chairs in my classroom, I had a little bit more of a flexible seating situation, then going up and even just talking to a group of 4 or 5 kids and asking them, okay, so what are y'all reading about? Talk to me a little bit about what y'all are doing here and this and that. And then trying to find maybe a common thread as you're listening that you can give that table a targeted compliment. Wow, I really, really love how, even though all of y'all are reading different things, I think it's really interesting that you guys are drawing on strategies that you've learned from your prior year. So like you're rereading different things. I saw you stopping and jotting something down. And one thing that you can do with compliment conferences, and this touches a little bit on that previous question, is I like to compliment things that kids are almost doing. I think that's really important, is we don't have to wait for them to hit that expectation to compliment them on it. So a lot of times I will say things, I will speak into what I want them to do. So if I see that somebody has a sticky note in their hand, I might compliment them and say, I love that you're using sticky notes as a strategy to track your reading. That's something that I do sometimes, and it's really helpful, where I jot stuff down as I read, just to try to collect my thoughts. So I see that you're using that tool. That kid might have been about to make a paper airplane with that sticky note. But sometimes just saying those words and speaking life into that kid will go like, oh yeah, I am using a reading strategy. You're right, miss. And so compliment conferences are a great way to help you to feel comfortable if you've never conferred with children. And it's also a way for them to really see that you see them and that you are there as a partner to lift them up. So that's a great way to do that. And with table conferencing as well, you see all of your kids multiple times. It's a way to make sure that every kid is heard and seen pretty regularly those first few weeks of school. Okay. From there, I shift into doing some research, decide, teach conferences where, again, I'm focusing on that identity piece of talk to me about your reading habits. When's the last time you've read a book that you liked? Really helping them to know, like, it's okay to abandon books sometimes. So getting them to articulate why they didn't like something, why they quit reading a book, why they're not reading. Going back to that question about what do you do when they're not reading? So I don't want to conference a kid to death. So I'm not going to see Susie in the back row who's like this during independent reading time, and I'm not going to conference with Susie every single day to like scare her into reading. That's kind of counterintuitive. But what I am going to do is Susie's going to understand that in this class we are readers, and my goal for Susie is that she sees herself as a reader, and I'm not going to drop it, and I'm not going to let it go. So I'm going to be asking Susie about her book very frequently. I'm going to be asking her, oh, you don't like it? Why not? I see that maybe you've only progressed a couple pages. Why? And I'm just going to make it more positive, but I am going to constantly ask her, okay, let's try another one. Let me recommend this book to you. And most of the time, if you give it enough time, I will wear Susie down, where Susie's like, fine, I will read. Just leave me alone. I also want to devil's advocate a little bit and say, a lot of times people will shy away from that independent reading practice because they're like, well, I have 4 kids that will not read. Well, let me flip that and look at the actual work that's being done where we weren't doing independent reading. So how many of your kids weren't engaged with that work and they weren't turning things in, or they were spark noting the chapters that you were asking them to read? And so I think what we find is it just feels a little bit more visible when we have kids during that independent reading practice time that aren't engaged in reading. But conferencing really allows us a way to use something other than grades and behavior management to address that need and to get to the problem. So I hope that that answers that question. And so then once we feel really comfortable and we've established some of that relationship and trust, then we can shift into that research, decide, teach approach where we're responding to specific data and specific needs of kids. And that can be scheduled. And I mean, you really have the power to make it what you want. So if you want to schedule conferences with kids where you share that schedule so they see that you're meeting with everybody, not just them, and that they have some mental time to prep for that conference, that's fine. But I do think what makes it really feel fun and responsive is being able to do that in the moment, impromptu conversation. I think that's where some of the best teaching can take place. So it's not one or the other. I think a blend of both is really good. And ultimately you have to do what works for you. So Faith, any questions about those things in the chat that we need to stop down?
Yes, there was a question from Danielle Harper about how do you address book shyness? For example, when you ask someone what they are reading and they are embarrassed to tell you.
So that's an interesting question. I think number one, one thing that I really, if I could go back in time, what I wish I would have done a better job with is not being super rigid in what response looks like for my kids. That maybe not everybody wants to sit and have a chatty chat with me all the time. And for some of my students, maybe that conferencing, they don't feel like talking, or it makes them feel really uncomfortable, or maybe we don't have that trust or rapport in there yet. So having maybe some silent response opportunities where they can maybe write some things in the reader's notebook and maybe you write and respond to that when you can, or like a Google document. Having some outlets to where you can slowly move toward having those conversations, I think is okay to do. I also think too that might just even be a reader culture thing, right? I have books that I get embarrassed when people talk to me about. I just read the whole Sarah J. Maas Court of Thorns and Roses series, and I don't want to talk about it with anybody right now because, oh my goodness, how is that YA? And I got real embarrassed that a high school kid is the one that recommended it to me. So like when people talk about like academic reading, there's lots of classic books that I've never read, gasp, or that I don't like, gasp. And so like I can relate to that as well. And I think addressing and having those conversations in class where we kind of talk about what it means to be a reader doesn't mean that you sit under the willow tree with a Walt Whitman poetry collection and, eat your crisp green apple and bask in romanticism. I know that Walt Whitman isn't a romantic poet. I'm mixing it up on purpose, totally. Anyway, but I think that a lot of kids have misnomers that they don't feel like they're real readers because they're not reading real books, and you can address that in your classroom culture. So I hope that makes sense. The series that I just referred to is A Court of Thorns and Roses, and if you have questions about that, I'll stay after when we stop recording and we can talk about that book series because it's very racy. Okay. So this would be a progression of just getting into that routine and structure of having conferences and having it be something that kids not only expect, but that they get excited about. Okay. So how do I make that time meaningful? Again, we don't want to waste our time. How do I make sure that conferencing is effective, that we get in there, we get work done, and that my students are growing? I think that there are 3 things that we can remember, and we're going to tackle each of these a little bit more in depth. First, being able to plan ahead. So having some ways to plan what you're talking about with kids, when you're going to do that, and kind of having some goal setting. And then tracking student progress and using it to inform what you conference about them next. And I'm going to share with you some tools that you can use there. And really the heart of conferencing is being able to ask good questions, to be very intentional in the way that you ask kids questions. This is the hardest part of conferencing, is knowing what to ask and knowing how to respond when kids don't respond the way that you thought they were. And it feels really uncomfortable and awkward until you feel like you get a good groove. So we're going to talk about these 3 things. So the first one being plan ahead. One thing that I think is really fun to do is to give kids some choice and autonomy in what you're working with them on. So even though this little anchor chart that I'm showing you is writing, I could easily tweak that as a reader, and I could think about the top 4 things that I see my students struggling with, or things that I see that would make a really big difference in their performance, in their ability, in their confidence. And so I could make an anchor chart, or I could do it on my board, or I could do it digitally, where I have 4 topics, 4 things that they could work on, and then kids could put their name by the one that they most want to work on with you. And that will also help them buy into those conferences a little bit more, because you chose this. You chose talking to me about this thing. And so it gives them a little bit more autonomy and control, but it also helps me to get what I want, because I want all of them to improve on these things. And so what I might learn from that, like looking at this anchor chart, is I have a lot of kids, and this is writing, but a lot of kids that really wanted to work on introductions and conclusions. I have enough kids there that maybe instead of making that a conference, I could make that 2 small groups of 4. So I could maybe pull a group of 4 and I could do some work with them, and then the next day I'd pull another group of 4. So it also informs me too on how they see themselves and what they think they need to work on, which is that whole thread in our new TEKS right about metacognition, to get them to think about, what do I need? Where am I weak? How can I be proactive in taking steps to improve myself? Okay. So one way that you could do that is, again, through scheduling. So this is not gospel. This is just a very broad example of one way that I might look at a 4-week time frame to make sure that every single student in my class got seen twice in 4 weeks, so that I'm seeing every kid at least once every 2 weeks. And that's with the assumption that I have some different small groups. In this little hypothetical, I built in some small group time for absent kids. That's one thing that I did when I was teaching, is I struggled with getting kids caught up when they missed. So every other day, I would try to have some kind of a small group where any of the kids that had been absent, I just pulled them real fast, 2 minutes, and did a quick reteach of whatever I needed. So, and we look at this, and this feels like it's really time consuming, or it feels like it's really daunting. Well, let's take that first Tuesday where I'm conferencing with 4 kids. A conference usually takes 2 to 3 minutes. So if each of those conferences took 3 minutes, that's 12 minutes total. Maybe add in some transition time, so that's 15. So if I have some kind of a structure in my classroom where I'm not lecturing for 40 minutes at a time, and I'm condensing down that lesson to 10 to 15 and then giving them practice, then I should have some time to do that. And this is with a class of 28. So if you have less than that, if you're from a smaller school district where you don't have those 25, 30, 35 kid classes, then you could really see kids more. But if you're worried about fitting it in, I think planning ahead and scheduling those conferences is going to be really powerful, and it's going to be really, really helpful. Okay. So that's just an example of what that might look like. Another thing, and this is going to be when you're talking about RTI, this is where we really need to be intentional here, is tracking student progress. I should be tracking what I'm complimenting them on, because I don't want to be redundant and say the same thing every time I talk to you. Like, yeah, I know I read fluently. You told me last time. But also saying that, like, how are we doing on the thing that we worked on last week? And I think kids need to be tracking those things. So in their notebook, maybe having a place in the back where they put the date of the conference and then what they're working on. So a little reminder. So that way, okay, I want you to open up and I want you to tell me what we worked on last time. And let's talk about how that's going for you. So that's one way to do it. I'm going to show you this quick document, and this is a document that you'll receive at the end of the training today. But this is just a quick little data sheet, and you can use it one of 2 ways. So in this example, it would be like 1 sheet per class period, where you would have the name of the student, what did I compliment them on, what did I give them as a teaching point, and what's next? What do I want to start working with them on in the future? So that way I can start forward thinking. And then the next time I can follow up and we can practice that thing again, so that I can look at a glance and say, oh, well, Faith and I've been working on this for 4 different times and it doesn't seem like we're improving. So maybe I need to think of it a different way, or maybe there's something else that I can do that can help us move forward. My preference, instead of going student one, student two, is, and this is me being extra, so recognize that this would not work for everybody, but I had a little bucket where I had one clipboard per class period. So I taught on a block schedule. I had 6 total class periods on an A-B day where I had a class full of kids. So each class would have their own clipboard, and I would have one paper per kid on that clipboard. And the reason why I did it that way is because I like the visual of going, oh, I've met with Sarah 3 times, but I haven't met with Danielle once this 6 weeks. So then I can see very quickly at a glance those patterns as well of, okay, we've been working on this consistently and I'm not having to flip through. So my preference would be 1 sheet per kid, and I put them in a notebook or on a clipboard where I can just grab it when I'm walking around, and it's not something that's super awkward and time consuming and tedious. I can fill it out in the moment. If you prefer something digital, I'm going to show you a tool. Well, let's see if I'll show you or just show you the link. Google Keep is a really great resource for you when you're collecting artifacts. So it's almost like academic Pinterest. If you have a phone or an iPad, you can snap a picture of something and then you can label them and categorize them. And so even if you did a label for each class, or you could do a label for different skills, then that's a great way for you to collect evidence and artifacts. So if I saw a kid writing down some really great things in their reader notebook on sticky notes, maybe I snap a picture of that, and now I have that anecdotal data to show what that kid is able to do. So when I think about the old school, like making copies of their work, it's a great way in a moment. I could even record a video of them reading, or I could record a conversation or a conference, and I can put that into my Google Keep and I can collect it digitally. So I'm more of a paper person. So the little sheet worked well for me. But if you're pretty tech savvy and you're looking for a digital way to do that, then that might work for you. Okay. And then I'm going to do one more thing, and then we're going to stop for questions. And you will, again, get that cheat sheet. So this, to me, is the most important thing that we're going to talk about, and that's intentional questioning. This is where people give up on conferencing because they feel really uncomfortable and they feel awkward. So questioning is something that you have to practice. And the best PD I think that I ever received on being responsive with conference is I had to role play conference situations with another teacher where we would do hypotheticals, and I would say, here's the student that I want you to be. Here's where you will push back. And here's where we're going to struggle. And I want you to challenge me. I want you to try to throw me off. And so then I would practice my questioning. Conferences are not a time for you to talk at kids. If you were to watch a video of a really good conference, the student would be doing most of the talking. That's where that research piece comes in. And really when I start to talk is when I'm doing that teach piece, but even that is gradually released. Okay. So I have that metaphor up there that if conferencing is the car, then questioning is the steering wheel and student responses are the pedal. So questioning is how we're getting to where we want to go, but it's the student responses that move us forward, okay, that accelerate us. So I'm going to share with you, and you're going to receive this, just a quick at a glance set of possible questions. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with having a handout when you're starting to conference where you have some stems for yourself. I think that when we do that, we model with students that it's okay to use tools to help us grow. It's not embarrassing, it's not silly, but I might have this on my clipboard in the back where I can just look under and get some ideas. So I have some research decide, teach questions here. So maybe what are you working on as a reader? How is that going for you? What is your goal for your reading today? And then even, can I listen to you read? That is something as a high school teacher, I don't think we do enough, is instead of making our kids do round robin reading in a whole group setting, yeah, I need to listen to them read, but let me do it in a non-invasive way where I'm conferring with a kid. I actually modeled a reader workshop in a district this year where I went into an 8th grade classroom, and there's about 25 kids in there. And the whole team of teachers were in there watching me. And so I did a quick mini lesson. And then I saw a girl who was reading a book about this thick. And I thought, oh, she'll be a real easy conference to start off with. Like, we'll do some really high level things. I was getting that vibe. Like, she's going to be the strong reader. So she started talking to me, and I was like, you know what? Let's just see what happens. And I said, hey, do you think that you could just, wherever you are in your book, could you maybe read me a few sentences? I just want to listen to you read if that's okay. She's like, oh, sure. We saw some major decoding issues as this girl started to read. And it was something that I'm like, this could really affect her even understanding of what she's reading in the book. So I was able to stop down and just give her a very basic decoding strategy that she was like, I never really knew how to do that, about chunking out words that were difficult and trying to pull apart the little segments and things. And so the teachers all were like, yeah, I never would have known that. Her teacher said, I didn't know. She's always up here. I didn't know. So sometimes just asking kids to read to you, that can really be revelatory in things. I have some compliment stems here. And then on the teach language, I try to avoid the I want you to language, because I don't ever want kids to just do something because I say. I want them to do it themselves. And so, is it okay if I show you something? Why don't you watch me as I do this? Let me show you how. And then with links, now I want you to try, I'm going to come back. I want you to show me how you do this. Remember, as you read any text, you can do these things. Or I might leave them a sticky note and say you can use this artifact to help remind you. Okay. So those are really basic, but those are some things that might be helpful as far as just knowing what to ask in a conference. So let's check in. Any questions in the chat that we need to make sure we address about planning ahead, tracking student progress, and asking questions?
I just see one question about an app that could be, I don't know, it's called Scannable.
Oh,
Ms. Rodriguez, she was asking.
I have never I've never used Scannable, so I would love some more information about that. And yes, Jennifer, I will be sending those documents. I see Penny Kittle has some great question examples and some videos of student conferencing. If you guys want, at the end, I'll share with you some resources that have been really helpful of different people. I think it's helpful to see different styles of conferring with different leaders. Penny Kittle is one that I love and cling to and I use all the time. So at the end, I'll maybe make some book recommendations and some places where you can see some actual videos of conferences that would be helpful, okay? So, and this is one of those books, speaking of. So if you have not read Kate Roberts, A Novel Approach, I cannot recommend it enough. Basically, Kate Roberts takes the whole class novel, which is the thing that we tend to really love and cling to, and shows you how to do responsive workshop instruction, even in using a whole class text. And she has a whole chapter on conferencing, and she has videos where if you buy the book, you get access to her videos, where she models all different kinds of conferences for both middle school and high school. So it's all geared towards secondary, which is so great. But Kate brings up this hierarchy of reading skills, because I think something that we don't ever really want to admit to ourselves as secondary teachers is that we know a lot about literature, but nobody in college ever really taught me how to teach a kid how to read. And that is a gap that I have had to fill in myself. Thank goodness when I got my master's degree, I learned some things, but I mean, those are few and far between. So that's why I think sometimes we cling To Kill a Mockingbird, because like, I know literature and I know it well, but I don't know how to help you with decoding. I don't know how to help you with your fluency. And so she gives this really nice tangible hierarchy that I want to share with you, that when you're thinking about figuring out what they need in a conference, this is a great starting place, okay? So the first level would just be monitoring for sense. So can a child, and when I say child, we know that I mean a young adult, read and understand who are the characters, what's the setting, give me some like basic plot points. And so when I start questioning a kid for the first time and I really don't know, that might be where I start, as that foundational thing. And what I'm looking for in my questioning is the pressure point. I'm looking for the point where the kid really struggles to answer the question, where there's a lot of hesitation, a lot of wait time, or maybe they answer the question and we know that it's wrong. I'm looking and I'm starting to build up this pyramid, and I'm trying to find the spot where I'm stumping the student, okay? So I'm going to ask this question, monitoring for sense. Okay, well, maybe they flew through it. So next I would have them read aloud to me and just kind of listen for that fluency piece. Okay. Yes, check, we've got that. Then maybe I start to ask them to make some predictions and to tell me why do you think that's going to happen, and getting them to point in the text where they're getting some of their ideas from. Okay. Yes, we did that. Check. Then maybe I have them start to make some inferences. And so specifically with fiction, this is a little easier, where we start to think about character, to make some inferences about some of those internal character traits and conflicts, and seeing if they can again justify their thinking in the text. If they fly through that, fantastic. Then I'm going to start asking them to interpret some figurative language for me. Okay. Then maybe we move to analyzing author's craft. Why did the writer do it that way? Why did the author choose this? And how does that impact the text? And then we can go all the way up to using critical lenses. So if you look at it from this perspective, conferencing isn't for the struggling reader. It's for all of our readers. I used conferencing in my AP literature class, where I would challenge kids to, okay, let's look at this from a psychoanalytic perspective, which sounds crazy, but I mean, I had kids that needed that support. Let's look at this from a feminist perspective, and how does that symbol change in the novel when we're looking at it in that way, in that lens. So this is a great way to start at the bottom, and whenever you start to stump them, you stop. And then we're going to work at that level until we start to really see some mastery, and then I can slowly ooge forward. So I'm never going to have to really do the litmus test again, but wherever I stump them, that's where I'm going to stop. I have a handout that you will receive, and this is all based on Kate Roberts' work, where I added some question stems for each level. So these are some things that you could ask at each of those levels. And if you notice, there's a star by the inferring. If you know a student isn't struggling and you know that they're really ready for that higher level piece, you don't have to ask them plot questions. If you are sure that that student is ready to move on, our strong on-level readers will probably start with that inference piece, because everybody can use some help there. So if you don't want to start all the way at the bottom, but again, devil's advocate, with that student that I was referring to, I would have probably made the assumption that I could start with inferencing, and then I'm glad that I had her read to me. I know that we're running short on time. Are there any questions that I can answer quickly about just asking those intentional questions, or even thinking through that hierarchy of reading skills?
A question in the chat is about, what if we are still doing things virtually at the start of the school year? Do you have any suggestions to how to do conferencing in a virtual situation?
That is a really great question. So let me get to this next slide here, because I think it kind of goes along with just the visual. So I think that if we're going virtual next year, first and foremost, you can't really conference with kids that you don't know. And we are going to be tasked to get to know kids in a virtual environment for the first time. And that is scary, and that is really daunting. And I don't know that I have a lot of answers for you for what would be the perfect approach to do that. I am thankful that there are tools at our disposal that allow us to see people's faces. So things like Zoom, things like Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, whatever tool your district uses that is safe. And I mean, this is, again, the assumption that your kids have access to devices and to internet. But those live things are great. One thing that you might consider is using tools that aren't necessarily live, but that at least have that face and voice connection. So things like Flipgrid, you can set Flipgrid up to where nobody sees a kid's video except you, and then you can record video responses back to them. So I've done this before, even just as a way of collecting data, is having kids read to me in a Flipgrid setting, or I'll set up a board where if students have access to their individual goals, which is something that I think you could do in a Zoom setting that might be a little daunting, but those first few weeks of trying to set up and trying to do some one-on-ones, or even like smaller group type conferences where you have them to start setting goals, then they can talk through their goal on a Flipgrid, and then they can talk about their text, and then you can give them real-time feedback. You can also do those things on platforms like Canvas, where you can leave video responses. And I think too, using even something as simple as a Google document where you can type back and forth and interact that way. Those are some ways to do it as well. But not knowing how many kids you have, you might have to do that more in a small group setting. Just because it is what it is, it not being ideal and not being perfect. The beauty of online learning is that we have those visuals that we're providing with them that they can use as artifacts. So things like a Flipgrid response, kids can go back and watch that multiple times. So it's a constant reminder, and they have that conference captured, which is something that's really, really nice. It's basically that they have that one-on-one support whenever they need it. I think about myself as an online learner and how many times I have to watch the video when I'm working on an online class and pause it and go back. And so ways that we can do that, and even things like what we talked about, picking the 4 pieces and having them choose, and then maybe meeting with those groups, I think would be really powerful. So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but the more that we can provide those tangible artifacts for kids to refer back to, and getting them to start helping with getting them to start making those individual goals, I think is going to be really important. I would say too, you don't have to find 16 pieces of technology to do that. Find 1 or 2 things that work really well for your students that they feel like they can master, and focus on using those tools as best you can. I think that one thing that we've learned is we don't want to overwhelm kids with technology, and we don't want to overwhelm ourselves and parents with technology too. So I don't know if that fully answers that question. That's something that I'm wanting to really think about and maybe put something together. I am teaching a blended learning ELAR instruction 6-hour session in July, where we're really looking at what does good ELAR practice look like in a digital space. How do I take all the things that are wonderful that I love in a face-to-face environment, and what happens when we have to make that virtual, and what translates, doesn't, and when it doesn't translate well, what do we do? So I don't know if that answered that question or not, and I can stay after a little bit too, to see if I can provide some more clarity. Okay. So for the sake of time, we're almost out of time. So I do want to make sure that we talk about, how do we self-assess? How do I walk away from a conference and know whether or not I accomplished anything? 3 things that I think we can factor in is, who did most of the talking? I know it feels scary, but if you can, and if you have permission to do so, record a couple of conferences and then go back and watch that through a critical lens to watch and count how much time did I spend talking? How much time did the students spend talking? I know it feels funky, but that's a great way to evaluate how that went. Also really thinking about, in that conference, were you able to determine some kind of a strength of that student or something that needs improvement? Were you able to identify those pieces based on your research? And if not, usually that goes back to your questioning. And then, were you able to find an area of growth, and how? So we always want to make sure that we can support those identified things by data. So one of my biggest things that I wish I never heard again is when middle school and high school teachers tell me that kid can't read. That is a very broad statement, and it reflects a lack of knowledge on really what's going on with the student. So when you say a kid can't read, do they not like reading? Are they apathetic? Are they so busy that they literally don't have time to read? Or do they have a fluency issue? Do they struggle with decoding? Do they struggle with academic vocabulary? So when we're talking about a kid can read or can't read, those are some things to consider, okay? Of really knowing and identifying. And if I say that my student struggles with academic vocabulary, how do I know that? Do I have something that I can show that would be evidence of that? So Faith is going to post the link to the Google attendance form for anybody that didn't fill that out. And she's also going to post the link to the Google folder that has all of those documents for conferencing. And just as an FYI, I am doing a writing conference tomorrow, and it's going to be a lot of the same things, just through the lens of writing. So there are some writing documents in that folder as well. You'll have access to both. And I think it's set up to where you have to download those documents. You can't edit them, but if for some reason I messed up on the Google, please let me know. And I'll make sure that that's right. So I'm stopping recording now.